My name is Veronika Zablotsky. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the convener and chair of today's event, which is titled Engendering Borders, Media and Migration Reframed, featuring as speakers Krista Lynes of Concordia University in Montréal, Jennifer Kamau of International Women's Space in Berlin, and Greta Olsen of the University of Giessen. So thank you so much to the three of you for joining this conversation today. It's really a pleasure to have all of you with us. Today's event is really concerned with the ways in which racist and sexist logics intersect with other categories of power in media framings of migration and migrants that are profiled often as security risks purportedly, or during the pandemic as vectors of contagion even, or simply treated as expandable others whose lives and human rights appear to matter less or very little at the external and internal borders of Fortress Europe or in the borderlands of racial capitalism and settler colonial partition in the Americas. At this particular geopolitical moment of warfare and mass displacement in Ukraine, this event brings together distinguished scholarly and activist perspectives and connects refugee activism and anti-racist feminist resistance in the Black Mediterranean with migrant solidarity movements in the Americas that are grounded in intertwined Black abolitionist histories of fugitivity and political geographies of the struggle for indigenous self-determination. Our goal is to highlight not only the violence and the structural exclusions of neo-colonial border regimes at a global scale, but rather, as we do this, to center and to learn from the political analysis, feminist movement work, and DIY media practices of refugee activists and collectives, such as International Women's Space, who push back and reclaim their own image, narrate their lives on their own terms, empower each other, and invent new forms of political organizing that teach us how to be in solidarity and inspire us to imagine alternative futures. So it is truly an honor to have you with us, Jennifer Kamau. Thank you again, and it is a privilege to be able to have this conversation with all three of you. Today's event is hosted by the research group Media and Gender at the Center for Media and Interactivity at Giessen University, in collaboration with the research section Transnational and Intersectional Critiques of Power at the Giessen Graduate Center for Social Sciences, which I co-directed last semester as a visiting professor of gender studies. It is also the final event of a lecture series with the same name, Transnational and Intersectional Critiques of Power, that we launched last semester with colleagues, some of whom are with us here today in the audience, so it's wonderful to see you. And this lecture series showcased Germany-based and international feminist research, Black feminist and post-colonial critiques, abolitionist and activist perspectives, and marginalized histories of anti-racist migrant feminisms in Germany and beyond. Before I move to the introductions of our wonderful speakers for today, I would like to briefly mention a few items of housekeeping. So during the main part of this discussion, which is about to commence, you will notice as an audience member, you are not currently able to unmute yourself or start your video. But in the end, when we have a discussion with the audience, so the Q&A, afterwards you will be able to pose questions for yourself. And I only ask that at that point, please use the raise hand function, which you should see at the bottom right corner of this window. There's a little hand, and if you click on it, I will be able to see that you would like to pose a question during the Q&A. So if you do that, I will be able to see in what order the questions are being asked. And because this event is being recorded, which I mentioned in the beginning, if you would prefer for your voice or your video to not be featured in the recording, you're also welcome to type your question in the chat, and really at any point during this conversation, you can already type in the chat, and during the Q&A, I will be happy to read your question on your behalf and pose it to the speakers. All right, so after having said a lot of things, before we move to the presentations, I would like to invite Jutta Hergenhahn to share a few words of welcome with us. Jutta is the Executive Director of the Center for Media and Interactivity, which is co-hosting today's event, and the spokesperson of the research group on media and gender. She's a political scientist and graduated with a French-German degree in political sciences from the Institute for Political Sciences in Paris and Free University of Berlin, where she also obtained her PhD. Her recent work is about non-sexist language and anti-feminism, and forthcoming about imaginations of women as presidents in television series. All right, Jutta, thank you so much for sharing a few words with us.
Thank you very much, Veronika, for introducing me, and a very warm welcome also on behalf of the research group on media and gender at Giessen University's Center for Media and Interactivity, the ZME. We are very pleased to co-host today's event together with the Giessen Graduate Center Research Group on Transnational and Intersectional Critiques of Power. We are very grateful to Dr. Veronika Zablotsky for having initiated this conversation when you, Veronika, came to Giessen University as a visiting professor last semester. We feel very honored to have the opportunity to listen to Jennifer Kamau from the International Women's Space, to Professor Krista Lynes from Concordia University in Canada, and to Professor Greta Olsen from Giessen University, who is also the co-director of the ZME and a member of the research group on media and gender. Today's panel discussion fits actually very well with earlier debates on media and migration we have been having at the ZME. For example, the interdisciplinary workshop on images of migration in 2016. It also represents the research group on media and gender's approach of bringing knowledge created by political activism and academically produced knowledge to a fruitful exchange, and to extend and intensify the exchange with political activists in the fields of gender and feminism. This also resonates with the approach of the edited anthology Moving Images, Mediating Migration as Crisis, edited by Krista Lynes, Tyler Morgenstern, and Ian Allen Paul, where the editors state, movement work is always knowledge work and always theory. The ZME's research group on media and gender was founded in 2016. Professors and young researchers from English and American literature and cultural studies, Romance studies, political science, sociology, and history of art work together on a wide range of topics. We consider media in a broad variety of senses as tools of communication, information, of political deliberation, teaching and learning, as shared spaces of experience, as evolving technologies shaping human relations and public spaces. But we do not consider media just as neutral instruments to transmit information. We are always interested in the way the medium is part of the message and in the way the use of media shapes society or politics. Our scientific interest in media is very much focused on digital or social media, but by no way limited to it. Equally, we do not consider gender as an analytical category independent of other structures of inequality or power relations. We are fully aware that the numerous forms of discrimination and inequality due to sex, gender, or sexuality are interwoven with other structures of oppression. We seek to understand how these complex and powerful structures work and evolve, where they come from, and in which ways they are sought to be overcome. Consequently, the members of the research group understand their research as a support of anti-racist, feminist, queer, trans, sex-positive, and anti-ableist forms of activism. More specifically, and just to give some examples of our work, we have organized debates on authoritarian populism, on the Me Too movement from a transnational perspective, as well as on body neutrality and hypervisibility, on transness in European TV series, or the history, language, and ideology of internet-based anti-feminist movements. And now we are very much looking forward to today's conversation about gender, media, and migration. So welcome again.
Thank you so much, Jutta. It's really wonderful to collaborate on this, and thank you for your untiring support over the past few months of putting this all together. So having said that, I'm gonna just swiftly move to introducing our first speaker for today, Krista Lynes. And in the chat, I'm going to post a few links for the audience members if you would like to learn more. You can also just save them for later so you can explore a little bit. Krista Lynes is a Canada Research Chair in Feminist Media Studies and Associate Professor in Communication Studies at Concordia University. They are also the co-director of the Feminist Media Studio, which provides a space for media creation and critical engagement with intersectional and gender-based forms of oppression and exploitation. They are the author of Prismatic Media, Transnational Circuits, Feminism in a Globalized Present, and co-editor of the open access anthology Moving Images, Mediating Migration as Crisis. And you can find the link to that open access anthology in the chat as well. Their current research project, Greenhouse Effects, the Mediation of Life and the Migration of Labor, seeks to explore how greenhouses have been a central infrastructure for the racialized, classed, and gendered global movement of humans, plants, animals, knowledge, and culture over the last several centuries and today. And with that, Krista, again, a warm welcome and take it away. The next 15 minutes are yours.
Thank you. I'm going to set a timer so that I don't go over and I stop myself. Thank you so much, Veronika, for this invitation. I'm really moved to be in conversation with Jennifer and Greta and all of you. I'm coming in from Tiohtià:ke in Montreal on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. I'd also note the big blue button, which is a nice alternative to more corporatist spaces of gathering, also began on the lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people only 2 hours from Montreal at Carleton University in Ottawa. So the spaces of research are also still spaces of settler colonial occupation. And even if we're in virtual spaces, we continue to occupy lands that have been stolen from other people, and that these kind of public pronouncements of territorial acknowledgements need to be accompanied by real commitments to restitution and land back movements in an effort to decolonize. And those are some of the things that I'm going to tie in a little bit as well, to try and think about our institutional space right now in the university and the political work we do as feminist media scholars, activists, and artists to engage in solidarity with social justice movements and migrant justice movements. So I've titled my introductory remarks Resisting Crisis, because I felt like in some shape or another, the past several years have engaged some modality or another of resisting crisis politics in a lot of different kinds of forms. And I put crisis in scare quotes because the projects that I'm going to talk about are not about seeing crisis as a periodizing term, like something that happened at a particular historical moment, or as a causal framework, right? This happened and led to a crisis, or even as a political fact. But as a political operation, and often a biopolitical operation, one that organizes people, that galvanizes actions, and that generates politics in response to perceived crises by whom, for whom, about what, right? And what I've witnessed in the projects that I've engaged in is that it seems ironic because crises are often alibis for both epistemic and real forms of violence, right? And as such, they're not real, they're manufactured, but they have effects that are very real and actually lived, and often lived as crises, right? And so I think it's important for our panel today and for thinking about feminist media scholarship and activism around migration politics and around critiquing dominant media discourses to think about how we function in relationship to categories of crisis and what that means for us and how we might respond to them. And so what you see here is a chalk drawing from a project I'll talk about in a little bit called Doing Feminism in the Pandemic. And the question that we asked in this public space, and this was in April 2020 during the pandemic lockdown, was what is the new normal, right? Because everyone was talking about this return to normal. And we wanted to ask, well, what is that normal? What does that mean, right? So a lot of the work that we do at the Feminist Media Studio, that we do in our collectives, begin with this question, what? What do we do about crisis? One of the contributors to the anthology that Veronika Zablotsky was also a contributor to says that the Greek sense of the word crisis is decision. So my co-editors and I, Tyler, Ian, and me, were already working together in 2015, exchanging on bordering mechanisms and the concept of trespass, when we became overwhelmed by the volume and the velocity of images that were coalescing around this term, migrant crisis in Europe, and by the EU nations' nationalist and ethnic absolutist response. We were scholars and artists and activists anchored in some form of media studies. And what we wanted to do was understand how the images that surged into view circulated and what questions they were sought to answer, what problems they were supposed to evidence, what responses they were thought to justify or exonerate. And in a way, we became fascinated by processes of figuration. What figures came to occupy people's imaginaries and how were they consolidating really hegemonic politics, right? And this is where an intersectional anti-racist feminism was really central to the project that we were working on. So the idea was not to say that we were in a migrant crisis, which was so overdetermined visually and politically, but still to critique the manner in which the crisis emerged as a phenomenon that did incredibly violent work. So with Thomas Nail, we wanted to reverse the crisis. It isn't a European migrant crisis. Europe is a crisis for people on the move, many despite their desires. We wanted to trace the crisis back to long-standing politics of imperial violence and racial capitalism. And we wanted to remain firmly committed to understanding sites of agency and resistance and creativity that have been there all along. And so we gathered a number of co-thinkers and co-makers at a summer institute in 2017, where, yes, we presented prepared papers, but mostly for 3 days, we brainstormed, we workshopped our ideas, we thought about the political implications, who we needed to be around in conversation with, the form of our intervention, what kind of scholarly political work could respond to the coalescing crisis that was taking visual, scholarly, and political shape and then disappearing all too quickly into a kind of abyss of forgetfulness, right? So the principles that we followed. First, the anthology had to be process-based, collective and collaborative, right? This was not going to be something where editors had a firm hand in curating different contributions. We engaged in like long-standing conversations with all the contributors. Each contributor talked to other contributors. We cited each other. We worked together to build our intervention. Second, the project had to be open access. And I'm now working to try and write a grant to get some of the essays translated into multiple languages and make those available too. Third, we remained in conversation with the activist organizations we consulted with. And we worked to try and redirect funds to support those partner organizations, even on the website which Veronika posted for you. So Imantes and Solidarity Across Borders, if people can download the text and contribute to those organizations, then we think that's an appropriate thing to do. And finally, and this is the kind of media angle to this, we absolutely took a firm line to refuse to reproduce the iconography of crisis in the pages of the book. So a key modality that was important to us was a politics of refusal, of refusing the terms of crisis by refusing the iconography of crisis and its racist, patriarchal, and homophobic dimensions, right? So the book didn't include a single image from the mainstream press. None of the academic essays contained illustrative figures. Our critiques were critiques of a fount of images that we argue had been violently implanted in those who saw them by the movement of media and their constitution of crisis. And instead, we were in conversation with artists and activists whose forms of visual practice were themselves also forms of critique. So these images were companion interventions in our anthology, ways of refusing the politics of crisis from above, of intervening in the image operations of nation-state violence. And they document activist responses, they engage in détournement of found images, they visualize other landscapes of creative and autonomous movement. And you see here some of the images from the book by Alan de Souza on the top left, a political action by LGBTQI refugees in Greece, 2 landscape images by Abdesamad El-Montassir and Zineb Sedira, and an action by Banu Senetoglu posting the united list of all the people who have died as a result of the EU's bordering practices. So what we hoped for this project was to remain politically committed to a critique in and through media analysis and in and through activism of crisis as a political fact. And I believe this attention to the politics of visibility and invisibility, of what choices you make about them, draws from intersectional women of color feminism and decolonial practice. And in the little bit of time I have left, I'm going to talk about this other project that emerged since 2020, which is called Doing Feminism in the Pandemic. And if you go onto the Feminist Media Studio's website and go into projects, you can find this project. So don't try and read this document. It's too small and too long. But we were trying to work on skill sharing with community members and with a broader community at the Feminist Media Studio when the pandemic hit. And folks were asked to quarantine and self-isolate. And the trouble, of course, was how differentially felt the COVID crisis was and how differently it impacted our community and our allies and the larger Montreal community we felt accountable to. First of all, the quarantine protections and isolations weren't available to everyone, particularly essential workers, many of them undocumented healthcare workers in care homes for the elderly or people who were working in temporary foreign agricultural labor programs brought to Canada to begin the farming season despite the COVID risks. Folks who didn't have access to Canada's short-term so-called universal basic income, which was far from universal, of course. So our working group, which consisted of Liz Miller and Razan Al-Salah and Simone Lucas and I, joined to create this project called Doing Feminism in the Pandemic, which had 3 aims. The first was to critique the terms of the pandemic crisis, a crisis for whom, about what, to argue against a return to normal, as if normal weren't unbearable to so many. And most importantly, to redirect funds to vulnerable members of our community, to consult with undocumented activists and allies, and to frame our actions around community needs. So our first axis was called, we had 3 axes. One was emergent models, one was the everyday, but the first one was called The Crisis Was Already Here, right? To say that there was already an Indigenous occupation around refusal of pipeline, and that was called Shut Down Canada before Canada shut down as a result of the pandemic. To see the ways in which this long-standing, unequal, distributed vulnerability was exacerbated by the pandemic. And so we asked a series of questions under this banner to denaturalize the language of crisis. And you can find this living document and all the questions on our website. And I'll just share one axis of it. Because we were in conversation and redirecting funds to Solidarity Across Borders, which is a migrants and allies social justice movement in Montreal, we were again prompted to critique the figures, the visual maneuvers in and through which the crisis was negotiated, and particularly the sharp divide between those deserving of care and those seen as instrumental in providing it, right? And so a student and I wrote a series of op-eds, and you can see one on the bottom right, against this language that was being used by the Quebec government of guardian angels. The Quebec government was saying that undocumented workers who were working in long-term healthcare facilities dealing with vulnerable elderly Quebec people were their guardian angels, and that maybe we should regularize their status and grant them permanent residency. Of course, this created huge rifts in the undocumented migrant rights community. We said, well, what about all the other essential workers who were not working in long-term care facilities? And what is this language of guardian angels? And so the original title of our op-ed was, who are the guardian angels of the guardian angels, right? We wanted to resist this presumption about who was deserving of care and who was providing it, and how differentially that was distributed as a result of the pandemic. So again, we were like engaged in this gendered anti-racist critique of the figures by and through which hegemonic bordering violence was occurring, and trying to put that into public space and also redistribute funds. And I'll end by saying we also did a series of community check-ins to always return to community needs. And so this was a community needs exercise we held around two prompts, which are, what's one thing you're doing that you wish you weren't? What's one thing you're not doing that you wish you were? And these were prompts to help us understand how we might siphon off the resources of the university, what Métis scholar Zoe Todd calls the ill-begotten gains of the university, to those communities who have been stolen from. So what can we do as a feminist media studio located in a university on unceded Indigenous land to resist crisis and act in solidarity with those made vulnerable by crisis? Concretely, what can we do as an institution, right? And I think that's part of also a kind of feminist praxis of media scholarship and media activism. And I'll just point to, as I end, we just got a 3-year grant to engage in this large partnership with two activist organizations, Palestinian Youth Movement, Solidarity Across Borders, 2 arts institutions, ADA-X and Le Sémaphore, and 3 universities, to build this project called Necessary Feminisms, Resisting Displacement and Forging Sanctuaries, that is really about thinking about the entwined forces of displacement and how we might resist them together collectively in and through media practice and media activism. And I invite anyone who's interested in the project to get in touch with me. We're really at the starting stages of it and building our research team, and really excited about this project. So I hope I stayed within my time, and I thank you all.
On the minute. Thank you so much, Krista Lynes. Unlike in Zoom or WebEx, there's no clapping function in this place, but nonetheless, thank you so much for this fascinating insight into your brilliant scholarship, principled practice. Very much looking forward to continuing this conversation in a bit. But for now, without further ado, thank you so much for this fascinating insight. I am going to share now in the chat a few links as I begin to introduce our next speaker for today, Jennifer Kamau. Jennifer Kamau is the spokesperson of International Women's Space, as I already mentioned before, an organization that she co-founded in 2012 during the refugee movement's occupation of the former refugee strike center in Berlin-Kreuzberg. IVS is an anti-racist feminist collective of women who have fled or migrated or who are racially profiled as migrants, as well as members without these experiences. In 2019, Jennifer initiated the Break Isolation Group within IVS, a self-organized refugee women's working group that formed out of the urgent need for political organization by and for refugee women against isolation and discrimination in and out of the German asylum system. The group regularly visits accommodation facilities, in German they're called Lager, that are used to forcibly settle and restrict the movement of asylum seekers in Germany to connect with and support women on the inside. When this work was becoming increasingly impossible due to the pandemic restrictions over the past few years, the group initiated its so-called camp reports, Lagerberichte, which feature audio messages from women on the inside that are, for example, shared as part of the IVS podcast series about testimonials about the specific conditions of individual women in different parts of the forced refugee accommodation system in Germany. So again, it's a pleasure to have you, Jennifer. Welcome, and the next 15 minutes are yours.
Thank you very much, and I am very honored to be in the presence of this very enriching panel discussion. I will just try to use the 15 minutes, so I just dive straight into my my discussion. in 2012, when we started the Oranian Platz movement or the refugee strike movement, it was also a situation it was a reaction to how refugees were being kept in camps. And we were fighting things that were affecting us. And those were something we called a Residenzpflicht law. This was a law that meant once you are registered in one district, you are not allowed to move to the next district. And we kept wondering whether we were prisoners or we were criminals. The second we were resisting was a voucher system. And with this voucher system, which was very dehumanizing, it came in denomination and you could only buy in very specific supermarket. So the image of the refugee person was always, you go to the supermarket, every commodity in the supermarket is in German, you cannot speak the language, and you're trying to calculate commodities to fit in the coupon that you're given. That's the image that came out of the refugee people living in different camps. The third, we were protesting not being allowed to study the language. The other thing, we were demanding the right to work. And the fifth, we were resisting deportation. And the sixth, we were talking about the isolation. Then come 2015, came the other crisis, which was now the refugee crisis with the Syrian migrants coming in. And always in these situations, when they talk of crisis, is validating, giving themselves the right to dehumanize people. So first they talk about crisis, and then they start to implement extremely hard laws or regulations towards certain people who are, of course, the refugees who are migrating. And then then came the COVID situation. That's when we started the audio reports, because in this time of the pandemic, everybody was on lockdown. There was a panic. Everybody was scared of death. But the women who were shut down in the lagers, nobody thought about them. Any information that came from the Ministry of Education, they were the last people to receive. And when it came in a language they could not understand. So our immediate reaction was to continue understanding what was happening in this shelter. Then now comes another situation of the Ukraine students. And in all these circumstances and situations, it's very clear it's certain bodies who are never included or part of discussions or decisions that affect their lives. And what is always the situation is everybody discussing these particular persons without including them. They're never part of the decisions of whatever is being discussed about them. And the topic becomes these persons, Black and people of color, and how they are portrayed by the media. It's either if you do not accept a victim position, then you have to be criminalized. And the process of this is never documented, in the sense that once you enter a country, nobody wants to understand why you are fleeing, but then comes you being denied the basic human needs in terms of what you're entitled to. And once you're denied this, then you are made vulnerable. And from this situation of being vulnerable, then you are criminalized. And that is the pattern. But people are never asked why they leave their countries. And this is something that we are trying to create a lot of advocacy work in terms of demanding that Europe takes the responsibility for the things that it has done. We want to take back the discussion of colonialism in our countries and the effect of plundering our resources for years and years to build the fortress Europe. We are talking about exploitation and we are talking about exploitation and unfair trade that is still happening, in the sense that anything that is eaten or people, everything that is used in Europe in terms of food or commodities, someone is being exploited somewhere in our countries. And these unfair trades, nobody is interested in speaking about them. We are also bringing into the discussion the border regime and reminding Europe that when it came to colonize Africa, it is the same paths or the same, they came through the same ways that the refugees are coming through the Mediterranean. And in that time, it was even a difficult situation because they just came exactly the same way. But now in the 21st century, when people are drowning in the Mediterranean, everybody turns their face away, because then it's the refugees who are coming to live on our social welfare, not discussing the continuation of the neocolonialism, the exploitation, all those things that I'm trying to bring into discussion, and how the media has always projected our countries. If it is not poverty, then it has to project disease or situations of war. There is not a single time, or when they want to bring something, is something like National Geographic, they have to bring animals. It's never about how people are organizing to change systems that have been in place even through even after colonization. How countries are beginning to how to decolonize even their way of living. How Europe still continues to, that we are trying to create a different approach, which we never get media coverage. For example, in situations where we are living now in Europe, in the middle of a war, that certain people can be taken out of the train stations, and everybody is fleeing war, but certain people should not flee the war. And this means that certain bodies can I don't know how to put it, but that even in times of war, certain bodies are not allowed to feel pain or to react to something, because then they can resist, their bodies can resist even bombs that are attacking in this situation. I'm talking about the Ukrainian students. This kind of perception is something we really, I'm very happy you're having this conversation. We have to discuss, because even when we talk about feminism, then again, when we talk about a feminism that does not that is against racism, that is against capitalism, then it's not a feminism that is sustainable, because it still feeds on the racism that we fight on an everyday basis. And the media and the politicians are the people who take the biggest responsibility in the pains that we have to live in this country. Because every time there's also an election, then the topic of migration is brought on board, and politicians are feeding fear with the topics of migration. Then after these topics of migration are fed into the society, then what comes is extreme racism, right-wing organized crime that has to perpetrate all forms of violences to the people who are not who are refugees and migrants in whichever spaces that they are living. And We are trying in our own little way, for example, International Women's Space, since we started in the movement, what we took very seriously is the topic of documentation. We document our everyday struggles. We have published books. We have made conferences on the topics of racism. We have done podcasts on all the forms of racism that we are perceiving in this country. We have done the audios because we realized if we do not document our struggles, then we give the media still the power to report about us in the way that they want to report about us. But for people who are interested in understanding how we enter into this country, how we are affected by daily racism, how we organize, what activities we try to do, no matter whether it is a small activity or a big activity, when we document, anyone interested is going to find this documentation on our website or the archives that we are trying to build. And we have seen the response of our very small organization that is of refugees and migrant women, the impact it has had in terms of being a resource center of the struggles of refugees and migrant women, now not only in Germany, also beyond. And for us, that's one way of counteracting the media and how it projects us and our work, how we are able to position ourselves and navigate this very white society in these times of all the crises that they want to mention. I don't know if I have exhausted my time or I still have some. I will wait for more questions. So, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer Kamau. You still have 5 minutes if there is anything you'd like to share, but we can also just expand the conversation later, really as you prefer.
I will wait for questions.
Okay. I'm sure there will be many. So thank you so much for these brilliant insights, for sharing this analysis with us, for telling us about the work of International Women's Space. I will then introduce our next speaker, Greta Olsen. I also, I still see Krista in the participant list, but the video is gone. So, but it seems to be under control with this platform. It's a little glitchy. Anyway, so I will just jump right to Greta Olsen's introduction. In the chat, you will find some more links, and you can learn more if you don't already, if you're not already familiar with Greta. Greta Olsen is a professor of English and American Literary and Cultural Studies at the University of Giessen in Germany. She is a general editor of the European Journal of English Studies and the co-founder of the European Network for Law and Literature. Greta aims to facilitate work on the nexus between political and artistic practice and academic analysis. She's involved in a project called Beyond the Male Gaze Towards Pluralistic Media Practices, and also work on the politics of images of migration as part of the DFG research group, Human Rights Discourses and Migration Societies. Relevant publications, just a select few of many, include Beyond Gender, Futures of Feminist and Sexuality Studies, published by Routledge in 2018, and forthcoming chapters in the Research Handbook in Law and Literature and the Routledge Companion to Narrative Theory, as well as her monograph, From Law and Literature to Legality and Affect, which will be published by Oxford University Press this year. We're all very much looking forward to that. So Greta, I'll pass the screen on to you.
I'd like to, first of all, thank you, Veronika, for bringing us together, and the ZME that I'm part of, but also for arranging this. Thank you, Jutta. Gives me an opportunity to learn more about your work, Krista and Jennifer. And I believe that I've had the pleasure of knowing about Veronika's work for some time now. Also the essay in this wonderful volume, she gave it to me before it was published. So I got to know you this way. I think it's important, and I'm going to focus on de-gendering borders right now, because the issue now, as we all feel with our sisters, brothers, and siblings in the Ukraine, and many of my friends have given people shelter. There's been an enormous outreach of generosity, solidarity. Regretfully, however, this has been a moment of racism and a moment of what I'll call ethnosexualization, following others before me. So thinking about gender and its intersection with race and class is, I believe, desperately important right now. So I thank you, Veronika, for starting that conversation. I'm going to place myself very briefly. Veronika was kind enough to mention the part of the research group I'm involved in at the University of Giessen, the University of Marburg, now the University of Frankfurt, and also the University of Amsterdam. And that is Menschenrechtsdiskurse in der Migrationsgesellschaft. We can't quite do the plurals and singulars, but human rights discourse in migration societies. This has been a research group that's been around since 2014 and 2015. Was initiated by Jürgen Bast, a lawyer, a refugee law lawyer, who's also involved with the Refugee Law Clinic here in Giessen, and also by Susanne Buckley-Sistel, who is a migration sociologist and a sociologist for conflict studies and transitional justice. There is a learning component of this in our curriculum here in Giessen. There is also an effort to try to interact with migration policies in Europe by the lawyers involved, called REMAP. And importantly, I think this group of 10 researchers here and elsewhere is not claiming that what has been called Vermenschenrechtlichung, also difficult to translate into English, the human rights turn, or a human rightsization since roughly 1990. And what is meant by that is a use of human rights discourse and images, I'm going to be talking about images, to argue for all manner of things. So not just for the right to live, to move. I thought it was very important that Jennifer brought up that migration and refugeeism, fugitivity, a term I learned from Veronika and also from Veronika and Krista's book, is often described as not being able to move, but that in our current migration regime, many of those who have migrated are not allowed to move, whereas citizens by myself have the right to move all through Europe and the world. This group does not say that this claim of human rights discourse is great. Some of us see it as neocolonial and as perpetuating global northern driven forms of power and coloniality. Others see it as simply a part of how we argue and think. So 3 researchers are looking at, for instance, how human rights is used by social workers to argue for the ethics of what they do. Another sociologist looking how human rights discourse and migration discourse is breaking down the border between being human and being migrant. Another looking at how in organizations like the one that Jennifer is working for, how one is and is not using human rights discourse as a form of protest and resistance against the current migration regime. There are 4 law projects involved. There's also a health project involved, claiming the right to health as a human right, particularly salient during the COVID period, which we're still belonging to. What I did in the project, or I'm going to be doing, was I was looking at images with a person involved in law, Jana Wessels. I want to mention her because the previous publication was with Jana as well. Looking at images of how the crisis was framed. The crisis, I note, Krista, importantly, using not the images, and of course, crisis is a metaphor. It affects us both visually and lexically. It is also a way of marking time in Germany and a European discourse, and it's a highly problematic term, also for the fear-mongering that it does. I was looking at images from the 2015 and 2016 period, and I want to say right now, some of the images that I'm going to be showing could be upsetting. These images already are upsetting, but I'm going to be showing an image of the dead child, Alan Kurdi, in a moment. If you're not comfortable with that, please be aware. I found it important that Jennifer Kamau said the word, people are dehumanized. That people, and I want to point out the importance of gender. Men, or people who are gendered as masculine during that so-called crisis, the large influx of migrants during the 2015 and 2016 years, were treated as non-humans in 2 different ways. On the image on the left, unfortunately, very frequent in logos, and often cartoons are important because they bring together a lot of discourses very powerfully in a way that photographs with that allusion to realism and mimesis cannot. We have, it's horrible, an image of refugees coded as non-white. We see black hair and bodies, what has been called massification. These aren't individuals. It's a huge mass of people, the refugees. And this also looks like in this tsunami of refugees or tidal wave and all of the associated terms that we heard in German and English and French and any number of other European languages. It looks like a tidal wave or a mouth about to swallow up the body politic of a Europe, pictured here as a bourgeoisie white couple, childless, on the land of Europe. Waves of Syrian refugees in Europe. The racial work, politics, the marginalizing is huge, as is the dehumanization. And this is one image. I could show you 400 like it, or also show you examples in language of how refugees have been dehumanized, not only during the crisis, but since then. Men, or those who are gendered as men, were also treated as non-human in another way during the crisis, and that is in each of these images is horrible in a new way. Refugees not welcome. This is a logo that became popular after the so-called Cologne night from 2015 to 2016. You'll recognize it, and it's because we all recognize it that you can see what it's doing. It is turning around the image of refugees welcome, and a logo that became popular in Europe in the early 2000s. It goes back to the 1980s in my country of origin, the United States. And it was originally the refugees welcome, the logo, heteronormative family, father, mother, little girl with pigtails used on a sign on the border between Mexico and the United States to warn motorists to be careful of families running across the border and the highway. That image, you'll know it, it's become a badge of honor. Here in Europe, we are good Europeans when we welcome refugees. There's a normative moral quality of that. Has been turned on its head with the neologism rape refugees. And the little girl with pigtails at the end of the original logo is now grown up to a young woman, as we see from her silhouette, and she has been chased by 3 predator men. These men, in turn, are troped, are figured as Muslim. One is wearing a kaftan and a head covering. All 3 are carrying weapons and masculine, about to commit sexual violence, and potential terrorists and criminals. So very simplistically put, and I could go into a lot more detail, this is an example of ethnosexualization, a mixture of gendering and racing men, and particularly Muslim men or those who are identified as non-white and Muslim as sexual predators, as criminal, and as potential terrorists. Obviously, this is fear-mongering. I'm going to show a picture of Alan Kurdi now. I want you to be aware of that because the image is disturbing, as are the images I've just been showing. Speaking of gendering, the other kind of most prominent image from the crisis and its aftermath are so-called humanitarian images. Here, the object of the image is a woman or child or feminized person. What I found most frequently when I would put search engine, the German Flüchtling, not gendered, would be an image like the one on the left, a woman, a veiled woman carrying a child, usually isolated, often her arms borne down, and either shown in isolation or with the people around her pixelated out, as in the image we have here. She is an eternal victim. She is Muslim. She is a young, burdened mother, not the person of agency or a legal person who can advocate for her own rights. She's someone whom we, the good, white, European viewer, German in this case, needs to save. An image that has become iconic, it's a series of images, but is the one on the right. I'm showing you the original framing in the version of the image that we know best. After the Turkish photographer Nilüfer Demir had made a number of photographs of dead children and people on the beach. This was picked up in Turkish language Twitter and was then taken up by the correspondent. She's a Washington Post correspondent, Liz Sly. And she cut the image so you don't see the Turkish policeman who, in many of the images we saw at the beginning of September 2015, is carrying the corpse of the child away. She cut out all the other people so we just see the child's body isolated. And this image became viral on Twitter. And then, and this is important, I believe, when we're talking about media and dominant media, social media is more important, I would argue, than traditional media in disseminating, sharing images of migration. This image exploded, and because it was all over Twitter, a number of photo editors decided then indeed to print it in newspapers. I could show you a series of how it was printed and how it was framed, with a huge outcry that this kind of image is too upsetting. We know that this image is iconic because it's been demonstrated, a movement from talking about the influx of people during the so-called crisis went from being migrant to refugee. In other words, not economic violation, but has to flee, and was extraordinarily important. Also important is the equally great controversy about the use of this image, a dead child, what it does, also turning this into aesthetic object, using it, deploying it, without necessarily the permission of the child's father. What was important about this image, because it became so important, was its narratability. We learned the child's name, we learned about his dead big brother Gallup, his dead mother Rihanna, and the father Alan, who survived him. And this is the power of a certain kind of image. It created a huge amount of outcry that European leaders needed to change refugee policy. Following the work, and but not only her work, but I'm simplifying, but particularly of Lily Chuliaraki about what she calls ironic spectatorship. I believe these humanitarian images, which are always of feminized persons, children, Veronika has used the word, put it together, woman and children, one thing. They are regretfully more about us, are looking at them, and are feeling good. This is an image from the Giessen train station. Since benzene has become so expensive, I'm only taking the train. It's in the underground of the Giessen train station. And you note in the triad of image, we have the not here, distant suffering, not a too suffering mother. She looks well enough with a child in her hand, and she's being protected by the hands of the giver. So you give protection. It is about the viewer, our feeling good about ourselves, our narcissism, our feeling we don't see suffering, we don't associate it, we feel good about ourselves. We are branding ourselves as good. So I want you to see the discrepancy, first of all, in images from the so-called crisis of the gendering and the ethnosexualization. Either anyone who was male, particularly if he was a single male, was a predator, or he was a natural disaster, an animal, or he was a super criminal. A woman and a child was an internal victim, and we, the good white European, were there to save her. I'm beginning to think, because my bigger project is, Veronika was kind enough to mention my book. My bigger project is about legal feelings. And I think most of us interact with legal and political acts through images, through reporting, and not through actual interactions with law. And this has been called alternatively legal consciousness, Rechtsgefühle in German, but I'm interested in the effective work that images do in terms of determining our attitudes towards migration. What I want you to see, and I see that in the way the photograph has been cropped here, and this in blue button look different on my computer. This is from the Wall Street Journal, a very recent image, and it's iconic, I believe, for the kind of images we are getting of migrants from the Ukraine. They are mostly women and children. We do not see people of color and Black people coming in, many fewer images of men. But what I want you to see is how different this image is from the ones I've shown before of women or feminized people. This is what the political scientist Heather Johnson calls a heroic migrant. This is a migrant who reminds us as Europeans of heroic migrants in the post-World War II period who were in, I would say, favorable demonstrations and representations, not only white, but middle class, well-dressed, and looking like they had agency, as they chose to move places because where they were coming from was no longer bearable. She is individualized, nearly looking at the camera, looking resolute, not impoverished. And to say that this is not a single image, because just getting ready for this talk, I found 100 like it. Let me show you images from 2 other news sources. One is from Unicef. Again, we have a woman looking resolutely at the camera, probably her child beside her. Different from the images from the crisis period. And in this picture from a German Protestant organization, again, talking about refugees now being placed in Auschwitz, being housed there, again, a resolute looking middle-class woman, youngish mother, looking off. Nothing will deter her. I am moved by the generosity of my fellow Europeans during this new crisis. I am also, however, shocked and dismayed by the racism that I see amongst us. I am quoting the Bulgarian Prime Minister, Kirill Petkov. This could serve as any number of statements about this migration crisis. I use the word advisedly. These people are Europeans. These people are intelligent. They are educated people. This is not the refugee wave we have been used to. People we were not sure about their identity, people with unclear pasts who could have even been terrorists. This is unfortunately not a minority view. And what I want to make clear is how a mixture of gender and race is being weaponized, ultimately, I believe, in both racist and sexist ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much. To the 3 of you for these moving and thought-provoking and incredibly important contributions to this conversation that by no means I have started, but I feel very privileged to continue with the 3 of you and also with our audience members today. We're now ready to open the Q&A. Actually, we've arrived at that part of the event when we welcome audience questions. And in a few moments, you will all be able to, if you so desire, unmute yourself and ask a question. And you are also welcome to type a question in the chat at this point. Currently, I'm not seeing any questions there. I will be happy to start us off, and of course also absolutely welcome the speakers responding to each other. We have a good half an hour, so if anyone in the audience feels like they would like to pose a question, I ask that you please use the raise hands button to let us know. And I would also like to ask Karina Müller to please give people the authorization at this time to unmute themselves if they desire to pose a question themselves. So I think at this point, I would like to give the speakers the first word before I jump in with a question to hopefully stimulate the conversation. Okay, and I'm also hearing that everyone in the audience now is able to raise their hand, to unmute themselves. So don't be shy and use this opportunity to be a part of the conversation. For now, I would like to give the 3 of you the opportunity to respond to each other, to engage each other. Perhaps you have burning questions you would like to pose to each other. At this time, that could be a good start. But if you're not prepared to pose questions to each other, I can prompt you. That's also fine.
I really appreciated, Jennifer, what you were saying about really reversing the kind of logics of violence and hypocrisy about the erasure of colonial and imperial violence in occupying different parts of the world, and then the kind of language of like people moving into one's own territory as if one hadn't already moved into other people's territory. I think those kinds of critiques are so potent and important. And I wonder how, if you could talk a little bit more about how you make that clear through the political and media action that you do at the International Women's Space and how that's received.
Thanks for the points that you touched on. I think what we do is that we try to position ourselves, and I will come very clearly, in terms of how we still navigate in this white society and how we manage to remain sane, and creating a space where we can talk about the racism that we experience in a way that it doesn't come back to, it doesn't eat us up, but give it back in the same strength that it is felt. And in this, we will use terminologies that are also very, terminologies that we have come up with, like the white saviorism, white fragility, the guilt traps. These are things that we have come up so that we can name things like we see or we feel them. And in this way, it reduces these discussions that are created when someone is trying to tell you to describe to them or explain to them racism, you know? And then the racism is still being inflicted back on you. So it is not in a very big space, but in the space that we have created, now we are able to do that. And being a grassroots group, we have become core in this, in the sense that even when you're invited to spaces, we don't have time to filter or become diplomatic in the way that we present, but we just let it out. And that is one element that we have found so healing in terms of how then when you talk about the situations you are experiencing, then again, the white fragility and calling it out that we are not here to protect white fragility, you know? It's a very difficult way to explain. I hope I have made it a bit clear.
Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer, for this response, and Krista for this prompt, for this question. There is a question now in the chat from Yannick Born, actually a student of mine from last semester, so welcome. And he's asking, I'm just going to read it, very broad question, but what can, quote unquote, the average person, end quote, do to help with these problems? It was already mentioned that just donating doesn't really help and is often done for the quote unquote wrong reasons, but I was wondering what other options there are. So this is a question about allyship, as I receive it, a question about how to act in solidarity, perhaps what not to do. Would any of you like to respond? Yeah.
I will just add that the cheapest way to allyship, what you're talking about, is donating, because you just press a button and then you can deal with your guilt that I gave some money. But what are you actually doing in terms of changing all the things we are talking about that are affecting us? Not even back in our African countries, but here in the streets of Europe. How are you taking a responsibility in terms of changing what we are talking about? What is your civic duty? That is what we would I would add.
Thank you, Jennifer. Would any of you, Krista and Greta, would you like to add anything?
One of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is like, not what can we do or what can the average person do, but that one isn't the average, but that the average person is already a really political construct. And we're already doing a lot of things. And we're doing a lot of things that can be really unwittingly violent in the categories that we use, in the way we move through space, in the ways we claim space, in the ways we move across borders, in the, all of those sorts of things. So I think, particularly within sort of decolonization movements in Canada, a lot of it is like, before you come rushing to us to try and see how you can help, look at the ways in which you participate in settler colonialism, right? And so I am someone who has 2 passports and move seamlessly through great swaths of the world. I need to be conscious of those privileges and how they ride atop a nation-state system that's responsible for disenfranchising and displacing so many people. And I think until we can start to think about like what we're already doing in the world to participate in or divest from different systems of power, we're doing a lot more already. So I think we need to sort of think like, well, who is that category of the average person? And what does it mean to say, what can we do? What are we doing in our lives? And in what ways are we already participating in nation-state regime violence? And then from there, what else could we do to divest ourselves, to go on strike from those forms of violence, and to not participate, to refuse to participate in the ways in which we're constantly being called upon to shore up forms of citizenship or belonging, or naturalizing senses of like what it means to be a good citizen and those sorts of things. So it seems really abstract, but I think that's where this kind of process of unlearning is a beginning for even beginning to be in solidarity with other groups. Because if you rush into other groups and say, how can I help? People are like, no, you go do your homework before you come and ask me how you can help, right? And I think that's completely legitimate.
Thank you. Okay, Greta, go ahead.
I'll jump in. I think that is the question, Yannick. And two responses. It's not, and I'm quoting something that I know you've heard, but it's not the responsibility of Black people or people of color to teach white people about racism. It's our responsibility. And I find the continuous, sometimes painful project of decolonizing my own thought is huge. And that is going to be a form of lifelong learning. And also my temporary able-bodiedness, something I've taken for granted in my not few years on this planet. And beyond that, the educational process is, for me, trying to be quiet sometimes, realizing my own authority and privilege through being a tenured professor. Veronika, the first time I met her, was speaking about the institutional gaze. And I think once there's a kind of learning about yourself, what I'm trying to do myself is give away power. But I'm humble about that to the degree, and I can talk to you more about doing that in specific ways, but I believe that is something that the position I have is perhaps something that I can try to use.
Okay, thank you, Greta, for this comment. There is another question in the chat that's very specific to Greta's presentation. So I will take the liberty as the moderator to jump in with a kind of more broad question I would like to pose to all speakers. And also to encourage the audience members to raise their hand if they can, or type in the chat if there's another question you would like to be posed. But I think one thread, a shared thread that I've noticed across the three presentations, and that was especially pronounced in what Jennifer shared. So I'm going to kind of perhaps use this opportunity to ask you to say more about this notion of decolonization and decolonizing, as you put it, Jennifer, decolonize border regimes and the role of reparations really for decades and centuries of colonial profiteering and expansion, extraction, exploitation that has enriched, that has generated the wealth that the West, let's say the European Union in this case, or Canada, the United States, etc., are hoarding, and in this construction of a kind of fortress to keep people out, to not, to prevent having to face the consequences of that colonial continuity that is now reinscribing itself in regimes of immobility and mobility. Who can come, who can participate in these in this wealth, who has the opportunity being here to even to work, to access education, etc., etc. So if we reframe it as an obligation to be accountable to the colonial continuities, and to reframe this not as a question of a humanitarian question of granting asylum, granting protection, but an obligation to open up and to allow for migration as decolonization, which is also the title of an article that's that I return to over and over by Tendai Achume, a legal scholar who's thinking about basically reframing migration in decolonial terms to completely shift how in public discourse we discuss borders, what they really represent, with all of the repercussions in people's lives. How can we think about reparations in the realm of migration, and how would it change the way that borders currently operate if we approach it from the standpoint of decolonization? That's a question for everyone, and kind of builds on what Jennifer shared in particular.
So I'm doing some research right now on greenhouses, and I'm looking at this area in southern Ontario called Leamington, which has been known as the greenhouse capital of North America. It's a space of intense greenhouse agriculture, and it relies almost entirely on temporary foreign labor contracts who come in for 8 months, who pay into the Canada Unemployment Insurance Program, the Canadian pension system, but never have access to permanent residency and never receive any of the benefits, don't have the right to unionize, and are sent back after 8 months. And many have been coming in a permanent temporariness for 10, 15, 20 years, right? I say the greenhouse is actually a blueprint for the precaritization of labor through temporary foreign contracts. It's a juridical apparatus for rendering labor precarious. At the same time, Leamington is a space where this greenhouse capital happened by the drainage of 5,000 acres and by the appropriation of land from the Anishinaabe people at the moment of sort of settler colonial occupation. And this happened as the settler outpost became a township, where they built energy infrastructures, where they gave tax incentives to corporations to come, and the H.J. Heinz Company came, and that's how it became the tomato capital of North America, and then the greenhouse capital. A tribe just received a land back claim, but that was federal funds for them to buy back land from settler growers. And so to carve out spaces of decolonization within this apparatus of growing that is 100% dependent in its increased yield and productivity on the precaritization of labor. And so I think this is a really interesting place to think about what forms of solidarity could take place between Indigenous land back movements and people rendered temporary and precarious by the juridical apparatus of the Canadian state. We're at the threshold of a new era of temporary labor contracts. And to argue for what rights of labor, what rights of rootedness, what rights to land might exist in these kinds of locations. And I think we have to completely undo the ways in which we think about the rights of citizenship here, where certain Indigenous communities refuse citizenship, where the people who come never have access to citizenship, and where the growers are the only ones who can claim particular benefits to citizenship on the nation state basis. And it's a really fertile site for thinking about. We need to, this is a total condensation of racial capitalism as it gets articulated within the kind of global economy. And that's the site where that hegemonic power has a lockhold on dispossessing people of their worlds, of their rights. And it's a really rich site where that kind of solidarity could take place that's both decolonial and no borders, and I think in a way that I think is really interesting.
Thank you, Krista. That's absolutely fascinating, actually. Very much looking forward to reading that work once it comes out. And thank you for bringing in all of these instructive, important aspects to keep in mind as we also engage in a transnational conversation across different contexts where decolonization might look very differently in context specifically. Perhaps I could ask Jennifer. I already had a follow-up question actually to what Krista asked, and I would like to combine it with this question about the meaning of decolonization in relation to borders as they currently exist, perhaps in Europe or in the German context. And it would be really, really interesting to hear more of your thoughts on this idea of decolonizing and the practice that you engage in and how you see also the media work that International Women's Space is doing as a political collective in Berlin since 2012, where, for example, I tried to listen to all of your podcasts. It's a really exciting archive of rich, important, complex conversations I can only recommend to everyone who is here. And what's particularly fascinating, or what I found so inspiring, is how each podcast is a mix, was my impression, of critical analysis, of information about the situation of asylum seekers in Germany, but then combined with first-person testimonials of the recordings of the camp reports, Lagerberichte, that you're sharing with your listeners, but also music. You also incorporate music, for example, by Nina Simone or Grace Jones. I just to spotlight some that I heard, for example, in the episode on life in the lagers during the Corona pandemic, the first episode you did in 2020. So could you just describe your process and how the group links political self-organization and resistance with empowerment and media?
Thank you for the question. First, I would like, first of all, to talk about the borders, not only in the external borders, but the borders in our heads, that clearly distinguishes between the white and the black. These are already borders in our head, that I am better than that because my color is. These are already borders in our head. And what differences this makes in terms of the reality of life, because of already this construct in the head, to the point of when someone has the right to be in a certain country because they belong to a certain category of people, you know? And what a passport does in terms of the liberty of crisscrossing many countries. And McHugh, when colonization was taking place, they didn't even ask for visas like they ask us. They didn't even need the passports, you know? This was disregarded. But now it is the most important thing with that passport. What is your passport? Do you have the permission? Do you have the right? So they create the status that determines whether you are legal or illegal, but it's still in a very wrong connotation, because even when you are legal, you are still not as good enough. If you cannot speak the language, you are even, these categories, these borders that are created in the head is what I want us to be conscious about, because it's from these small borders in the head that people have funny ideas. And I have seen how someone is called an illegal person. So you wonder what is illegal about a person that they have to be termed illegal, and what that term, being in that situation of that terminology, the vulnerability that comes with that term, the dehumanization that comes with the fact that you are illegal, you are undocumented in this country, is something we need to be very conscious about. And these are the first borders that we need to get out of our heads before we talk about Fortress Europe and what it is doing with this with external deportations and this funding that is being done, the militarization of the borders, the funding of this very big military deportation by Europeans to deport people, Frontex, that is what I was trying to think about. Let's start with the borders that we have in our head. If we don't reflect on those borders, then we will not understand why those other borders are very effective. And then coming back to your question on how we create our own content, is because we know what is personal is political, and we try to politicize what is personal, because what is personal is our lived experiences, which we try to bring out, but not from that victim position, but from the position of politicizing it. Because we know if we do not accept, we refuse to be victims. This is by choice. And that's why we take the responsibility of documenting our own struggles. Because we know how the images that were projected here, it's always of a woman that needs protection. And that's what we denounce. And we say that we are not victims. That's what we are against. That's what we are refusing with every sense of our being, of our existence in Europe. And understanding that the system, making it very clear that it's a system that is against certain people. And this system, which, regardless of whether it is in terms of institutional or structural racism, we should not take it personally that it damages us, because it's not our fault, but it's a system. And this alone helps people to not ask the question, why me? And it's from that point of strength and wanting to empower others that we are able to create the content that we create.
Thank you for sharing this. Very powerful. We have still about 8 minutes for additional questions. So the audience members are warmly invited to share their questions in the chat, or to raise their hand, to post their own questions. Somewhat lively conversation ensued in the chat. Liz kindly kind of summed up some notes from the conversation that came up that could be takeaways for audience members. There was a question from Emily Eisenberg about the practice of land acknowledgement in settler colonial context and what follows from them. And I see that Krista kindly already responded quite extensively. So I hope it's okay if I don't read out this exchange, but I wanted to draw people's attention to it. There's so many more questions, but I do want to return to a question that was posed by Thomas Spies who was asking a question directed at Greta Olsen. Does your research include ethnosexual framing in other media formats, for example, movies? Do you have examples for that kind of framing? So perhaps if you could briefly respond, and then perhaps we can have one more round of a question for everyone.
I'm going to first, as the third person, say one thing about borders and changing borders. And one thing that working through the research group has helped me to do is to think a little bit with more detail about how borders work in Europe. And it's, as we know, not just Frontex. It's not just the national border. It's also at the employment agency. If you have, as an Afghanistan person, the right to get training or a language course in German or not. And it is something that Jennifer spoke to. It is an experience that all of us have who are here in Germany, who is asked to show their identification and train ticket in the train it is not usually someone who looks like myself. And this is another way that borders work at the Frankfurt airport, in the trains, at the employment agents. The borders are literally not just at Frontex, they are systematically all through our geopolitical reality. Thomas, thank you for the question. Yes, an example of ethnosexualization from the US American term would be all of a sudden Asian American men who were feminized or not seen as masculine for a long time in the history of our gendered and racist and cisnormative US American media, all of a sudden they're hot. And I could give you 6 examples of mainstream media effects in which the Asian American man is now the heartthrob. That's another form of ethnosexualization. And what I'm most interested in doing in this research project is looking at social media, because when I brought up this topic, ethnosexualization and the racism of current reporting of the Ukrainian migrants to a friend who works at Swedish television, she got kind of angry because she said, we respond to what people want to see. We are in dialogue with them. This is proximity, etc. And I think, and she also said, we respond to social media, a little bit like the Alan Kurdi photograph that was so big on Twitter that mainstream newspapers said, okay, we're going to start showing it. And of course, they don't just print, they tweet and Instagram all the time now too. And what I'm interested in is how do emotions work in online exchanges, particularly with images of migration. And I believe it's something that we don't know enough about. And I also think it's hard to measure affect. We know that Facebook graded a thumbs up like with 1, and it graded an angry emoji face with 5. So we know that is being determined and also bracketed by algorithms, and we also respond to it, and we're figuring it out right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that response, Greta. If there's no more questions in the chat at the moment, and we're kind of approaching the end of our time for the Q&A, after which there will be an opportunity for the speakers to offer some final comments or closing remarks before we conclude this event for today. And I would like to return really to the title of today's event, Engendering Borders, and kind of invite all of you to reflect on the kind of intersectional quality of gendered framings of migration and migrants, and the politics of vulnerability, in the sense that what Jennifer also pointed out, who gets to experience pain, who gets to be vulnerable, who gets to be framed as a deserving seeker of shelter and protection, how those images are racialized, how they're mediated by racialized conceptions of who gets to be a victim and who by definition appears or can only be figured as a perpetrator. And so these linkages, these intersections of different categories in media representation, just as all of you so powerfully illustrated, call for an anti-racist politics, an absolute resolute anti-racist politics, in order to center or really kind of undo this victimization, dehumanization, sexualization as victims or perpetrators also, to center the agency of people on the move, people who have arrived, who want to stay, who are allies also. And speaking of agency then and media practices, how can from our respective locations, and this is an event that is taking place in virtual space, but is attached to a university in Germany. So how can we use institutional locations to further the possibility of self-determination, of people whose agency is continuously questioned, undone, made difficult in kind of the wider social context. So how can we undo these structures of oppression from within institutions or locations that concentrate institutional power? How can we work from within those institutions to undo that? And I would really like for Krista to say more about that, because in your presentation, you already addressed how you're approaching this at the Feminist Media Studio, and perhaps you can share more about how you approach this, but also, of course, Jennifer, Greta, how do you see the role of institutions such as universities in really aligning with and accompanying the activism, the instructive contributions of refugee and migrant activism to this overall conversation?
Yeah, I can start. I'll just say that the university has to be really cautious, because the university has a history of extractive research, and that any researchers who want to divest themselves from that project have to think about the histories and the suspicions that are really merited about who researchers are and what they're doing and what they want and what the outputs are. I think we need to work very carefully, very long-term, very slowly to build collaborations that are mutually beneficial and that are really not based on the kind of epistemic violence that the university's been responsible for a long time. So I don't have answers about that, but I do feel very, very cautious about what, as a researcher, I can and can't do, and what histories I'm responsible for. And I think that's, I'd say fails all the time, but we try, right? Because the university either has to be left to the dumpster fire it is, or needs to be occupied insurgently in ways that make space for radical forms of pedagogy and knowledge making and collaboration. So, but I wanted to end by saying, like, there was one thing that we didn't talk about at all, which was feminism and the vexed category of feminism, which, you know, Greta gestured to and Jennifer definitely gestured to, which is that, you know, feminism, of course, has been responsible for so much racist violence and has been such a category for ethnic nationalism and for different kinds of oppression, and certainly Greta's examples showed us something about that. And so we can't, of course, turn to feminism as an innocent category for doing the kind of political work that we do. And since we're a feminist media studio, we're very conscious about the limits and possibilities of feminism. And I take seriously Angela Davis' point that we need to build a unity that's both complex and emancipatory, and that requires a lot of work. But I'm also really interested in the fact that feminism, gender studies, LGBTQ and queer theory has become a target of a lot of very right-wing nationalist discourse as a threat to the society, as a threat to the community, as a threat to the nation. And rather than reject that claim? What happens if we hold good to the threat that feminism and gender studies and queer theory can make to the categories of ethnic nationalism, conservative family values, border isolations, and other sorts of things? In other words, if it is a threat, what kind of potency can the category hold, and how can we critique from within that really sustained suspicion of the violence of normativity, a kind of politics that could be potentially productive and complex. And so I don't take up feminism easily, and I take it up with a lot of suspicion about the violence of white women, and the legacy of that I inherit, right, and the work that I have to do to undo a lot of the imperial kind of legacies that I inherit. And yet I want to hold to that category as a potentially potent site for doing this kind of intersectional work that has really significant effects on how people are treated and where conditions of survivability are allowed to flourish.
Thank you so much, Krista, for these important words of caution and for returning us to the category feminism, even as you complicated and undid it in a sense as an opening. There's actually a follow-up question in the chat that might perhaps reframe my question helpfully, which is from Shaila, who was one of my co-organizers of this lecture series. So very happy to see you here, Shaila. Thank you for joining us. And she's asking Jennifer, actually, since Krista was talking about their book project and how academics, activists, and artists have collaborated on this project, I was wondering if you and the International Women's Space have done collaborative work with academics. If so, what experiences you have made working with academics on this topic? What role do you think does the university play in criticizing and decolonizing Germany's racist politics?
An interesting question. I don't know if I have the right words to answer it, but we are very cautious working with these researchers, because it's always researchers on our pain, and then we become extracts of resource, and then we are completely excluded. Then it becomes a topic that relates to the professor, not longer to the people that, there's a lot of politics in that. And that's why for us, we tell people, if you want to do interviews or whatever you want to do, you can use whatever information that we have produced on the website, because then we become the source of our story, And it's not that we haven't worked with academics, we have worked, but we also look at what academics we are working with and on what we question, that we have a very clear demand. And I will give an example. For example, even with the students, when they come to start asking for research topics, there was the Technical University, I think 2015, when they started writing, how can we help? And we gave them a very specific task, because in the Heims, it's very hard to get the data of the women. You cannot know who traveled alone, how many women are living in the Heims, what is their situation. So we tasked them to go to the Heims and give us make a research on the situations of the women in the Heim, give us the numbers, something that we could also come back and work with. And there was also another request that came after the pandemic, how we were dealing with COVID and the COVID situation. And we have mentioned even in the podcast that isolation, being able to isolate was a privilege. So we told the students, you use anything on those materials. And what they did, I think there was a university in Vienna or somewhere who did an exhibition on those audios. And that's how we work with the universities, because it has to be in an eye level and we have to be the authors of our own stories. That way, it's our story, but it's from our own. And when we talk of feminism and how destructive white feminism has been to our bodies, what white tears mean, why rules are changed, and in most scenarios, especially when Greta mentioned the situation of Cologne, when there was the white tears, then all the laws were changed to protect the white woman. And then there was the rampant deportation. The asylum process was made more difficult, more inhumane. So these are the kind of things that we want to be very clear on the positions on which whoever is trying to, who is asking to work with us. And in this particular time before my time expires, I want all of us to reflect on the situations of the university students that are coming, the Ukrainian Black students. They are students, they are not even asylum seeker. And yet they are already categorized. They are already given all these demands that they have to have blocked accounts. The process of changing their visas is impossible. What role is the university and the professors playing in terms of discussing this topic of the Ukrainian students?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Greta, what can your university do?
I'm going to throw the question back to you in 5 seconds, and I know we're running out of time, but I believe that they who pose the question needs to answer too, or to think further. And I want to say 2 things. I heard Denise Bergold-Caldwell's wonderful talk in the series, and it was that she wasn't optimistic about the future of the university. I see that differently. This has to do with my US American socialization. We still have in Germany more of a middle class, and we enable so many more young people to get a university education because it is state funded. This principle of distribution makes, for me, German universities with all of our problems so a principle of sharing capital that I cannot see that as negatively as some others do. I, like Krista, am in the struggle that, I can say not in my name, but white women and the figure of a white woman or girl, particularly a girl, is instrumentalized continuously to hurt people of color and those who are Black and those who are marginalized. And I can say not in my name, and I can also say I nonetheless have to practice to the best of my possibility a decolonial, anti-racist feminism for women XN, which is not transphobic. And I can only say a ground for us to come together, and Krista mentioned it, anti-gender rhetoric in the great replacement theory. Feminists are keeping white women for having enough children, goes along with anti-Semitism, goes along with racism, goes along with ethnosexualism, goes away with anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. And if that isn't scary, this backlash, and if that's not a grounds for alliance between us, I don't know what else is. How about you, Veronika?
Thank you for the question, Greta. It's very generous. Okay, I'm seeing we want to be accountable to the time limits we set for ourselves. Jennifer has to catch a train very soon. I will only say I can only agree with all of you. What all of you have already pointed out is, I think, very important to think about it both in terms of recognizing the agency and authorship and leadership of activist groups, initiatives, activist knowledges, to center those and to take a step back as a researcher to reflect on one's institutional affiliation. And perhaps I really like this formulation by Fred Moten on fugitive planning, to cultivate an almost near criminal relationship to the university and really redistribute the funds one has access to in a disobedient manner, and find any kind of formats that allow to have these kinds of conversations, to redistribute the funds that are available, and to stay humble about the impact that this can possibly make, and think about it as long-term collaborations that require mutuality, self-reflection, and as Jennifer emphasized so powerfully, a collaboration on eye level where one does not overestimate one's own insights as a researcher, and really just learns to listen rather than define a situation, which we're so trained to do all the time. So it really also is a question of radical pedagogy and how we interact with our students, etc., to try to really engage in some form of harm reduction is often how I think about it, because the violence is so structurally embedded and so ingrained in everyday conversations all the time. And as university teachers also, we have a unique position to engage our students, as well as reflect on our own positionality. Okay, but I don't want to keep dragging on and on, because I know the time is running out. And so I would like to once again thank the three of you, Jennifer, Krista, and Greta, for joining today, for being part of this conversation, for being so generous in your contributions. I can say that I learned so much, and I very much look forward to revisiting the recording. This has been such a rich exchange, and I hope it's just the beginning of exchanges to come. I also would like to thank the audience for joining us today, and of course also the research group Media and Gender at the Center for Media and Interactivity for hosting and supporting today's event, making it financially also possible. And lastly, also, of course, Karina Müller, who has been the student assistant, who's kind of helped us logistically make this a smooth event. So thank you very much also for your labor, for your support. And with that, I hope we will continue to stay in touch. Thank you so much again. Yeah, let's continue this conversation soon. All the best to everyone. Thank you.